have agreed to flip the sequence of the commentators, so we're going to go next to Renato Moro, who is Professor Emeritus of Contemporary History at Roma III. And he's been Vice Rector for Research from 2004 to 2008, and Director of the PhD program Political Studies, and now is a member of the Ethical Board of the University. His studies concern the relationship between politics and religion in 20th century history, especially Catholic political culture, and the relationships between Italian Catholicism, fascism, anti-Semitism, and anti-Protestantism, and also the history of peace and anti-nuclear movements. And among his many books, he has written on the subjects of the formation of the Catholic ruling class, the Church and the extermination of the Jews, Catholicism and totalitarianism, fascism and Francoism, war and peace, 2 books on Aldo Moro, the image of the enemy, and the myth of Catholic Italy.
Thank you. Thank you to all the organizer. This conference, I beg your pardon, because for an abrupt commitment, I will have to leave at 6:30. There is time, fortunately, but I beg your pardon since now. Well, in the last months, I've been intensively reflecting on the proceedings of the Stanford 1963 seminar. And my impression is that the extraordinary strength it had was in the frank, direct dialogue among experts with the only goal of a better understanding of issues and interpretations. And I think that the same should happen in today's attempt by the Mosse program to revive it. Hence, I will apply the same principles, and I will try to respond to Professor Traverso's keynote speech and open a dialogue with him. I'll be frank, direct, ready to change my mind, as many of the 1963 participants were. The problem at the center of Traverso's reflections is whether it is meaningful or useful to use the term fascism and fascist to describe contemporary political movements. I am a strong advocate of complexity. I have been continuously repeating to my students that they had to learn how to think in ambivalent terms. Why always yes or no, white or black? Instead, yes and no, white and black. So I appreciated very much Traverso's attempt to avoid univocal perspectives and solutions. I think that his effort has tried to avoid the widely spread trend of ghost-busting fascism, as Roger Griffin brilliantly put it a couple of years ago. Traverso, in his text, explicitly refuses Umberto Eco's category of an eternal fascism. And he proposes a complex and nuanced view of fascism, and at the same time, a complex and nuanced view of the new right. He has insisted in his last words on the fact that the neoconservative right is full of contradictions, and I have appreciated this very much. You have listened to the ambivalent elements, differences, continuities of the new far right and classical fascism. I have found many of his considerations illuminating on ideology, style, practice, values of the new radical right, and they have changed my mind in many cases. At the same time, I have to clearly confess that I have doubts and questions about, both about the methodological premises of his discourse and about his conclusions. First premise, fascism is not only transnational, but also trans-historical. You ever heard, the reason is that first and foremost, fascism is much more than a simple historiographical object. It's a realm of memory that affects our present and our political imagination. The fact that fascism is not only a phenomenon of the past is undisputable. Still today, there are leaders, activists, movements, and parties that refer to past fascist experience in history, want to achieve similar values and views, and use symbols, gestures, slogans typical of fascism. Sky Donay this morning recalled George Mosse's idea that bits of pieces of fascism are still circulating. I totally agree with this. However, I don't think that this makes fascism trans-historical. It simply says it is still alive. The relevance of the political imagination of the collective image of fascism is undeniable. Nevertheless, is it not this a feature of almost every historical phenomenon? From Caesar to Constantine, from feudalism to the Crusades, from the Reformation to the Roman Inquisition, from the Battle of Lepanto to the seizure of the Bastille, and from Napoleon to Bismarck, every manifestation of the past has been accompanied or followed by a collective perception that has amplified, transformed, sometimes betrayed its reality. Does this make all those phenomena trans-historical? Or on the contrary, does it make them doubly historical? That is, an historical phenomenon in their essence and a historical phenomenon in their perception? And furthermore, is the historian's task to mix or superimpose those two dimensions, or clearly distinguish them and analyze them separately? Second premise. Second premise is that there is a sort of structural difference between the 1963 Stanford discussions on fascism and the present. Contrary to now, in 1963, fascism was a bygone experience. And talking about fascism meant talking about the past. According to Traverso, what was then said about McCarthyism was simply an illusion. Well, in a certain sense, this statement is undisputable again. It is evident that today's global rightist wave is not comparable with the rightist trends of the 60s. However, after reading the minutes of the Stanford seminar, I drew a quite different impression. In my opinion, McCarthyism played not a secondary but a relevant role in those talks. After all, the attention to current events was then an intensive preoccupation for Mosse. In his book, Karel Plessini demonstrated that the crisis of the German ideology, the book at the root of the seminar, was born out of a double concern, I'm quoting her, a double concern with the past on the one hand and the present on the other. And in the book introduction, Mosse pointed the finger at some extremist groups, not only in Germany, also in the United States, that fused anti-Jewish and anti-African American sentiments. Mosse considered them little influential, but believed that they could still, in time of crisis, represent a danger, helping to create a racist mood by slowly poisoning institutions from the inside. So I wonder if confronting the 1963 seminar from today's perspective, we have a difference in nature or simply a difference in intensity, and that many of the issues that were then debated are very similar to the one of the present. So my conviction is that ideas about the problem of using the terms fascism and fascist to describe contemporary political movements, then as well as now, depend on which interpretation of fascism you give. At Stanford, Mosse tried to convince the audience that fascism, seen in an unavoidable comparative perspective, was not only a political regime, but a culture, an original ideology, and even a new religion is suggested. That it was a revolutionary movement, the wish to create a new attitude towards life and a new man, flying, he used the word, in mythical thinking. This approach caused him to deny that McCarthyism might be considered fascist, lacking almost all of those elements. But Mosse, at Stanford, was heavily contested by many scholars who denied the central role of ideology, differentiated between words and facts, insisted on power and political maneuvering, highlighted the centrality of foreign policy and revisionism, admitted that fascism might have been revolutionary in its methods, but denied it was revolutionary in its goals, and hence stressed its compromise with traditional elites. In this second perspective, establishing a link between historical fascism and many other rightist current trends was much, and is much, easier. And I think that things are not very different now. It is true, historiography, we have listened today many things about this. Historiography deeply changed. We have appreciated the decisive role of the First World War. We have seen the role of the middle classes' answer to modernity as a mass society. We have focused on the importance of the secularization of politics. We have understood the relevance on gender issues and normative masculinity. We have seen fascism as a global phenomenon. We have stressed its imperialist nature, its expansionist action. We have apprehended the existence of web exchanges between fascists and the liberal rightist movement. All these new interpretations have made our view of fascism more complex, of course. However, I think they cannot transform fascism into a hybrid, contradictory, Janus-faced entity without individuality, originality, and autonomy. When fascism is defined as a form of liberal totalitarianism, when it is interpreted as any global counter-revolutionary and anti-progressive stance, or simply as an aggressive, coercive, and violent movement, or a form of polycratic social and political practice based on homogeneous and racist communities, when it is identified in the more intervention of the state or in Islamic terrorism, as it has been done, I think we risk to lose any conceptual or historical accuracy and enter the Hegelian night in which all cows are black. I do not deny that some relevant changes can happen in today's fascist movements with respect to classical fascism. what I'm not ready to accept is that fascism may become more or less everything with a connection with violence, intolerance, xenophobia, racism, discrimination, nativism, and colonialism. We know very well that not every fascist was a xenophobic, racist, or colonialist, and that not every xenophobic, racist, or colonialist was a fascist. We have a great tradition of studies of fascism, which Mosse was one of the more brilliant exponents, and I think we must not forget its main results. Concluding his groundbreaking study on fascism in a comparative perspective, Stanley Payne, locating his research in this tradition, defined fascism as a new epoch-making revolutionary phenomenon with an ideology and a peculiar assembly of its revendications. I think we have to follow these suggestions and try to individuate some key features essential to every fascism, the classical and today's fascist group and movements. The form of a militia party, that is, military mass organization, uses violence, the revolutionary element, the aspiration to an anthropological revolution, the totalitarian abolition of any distinction between public and private life, the presence of a political religion with symbols, rituals, saints, and martyrs, an integral imperialist warmongering militarism. By the way, on totalitarianism, I would suggest to reconsider the complete Mosse's negation of the category. It is true, Mosse refused it explicitly, but refused it because he was afraid of its applications to the comparative interpretation of the Soviet regime, but continued to use the concept as a total aspiration, as a goal to totalitarian control of society. At Stanford, for example, he expressed his doubts on the term, but he added that they were on the word as it is generally used. And in another discussion, he admitted that the seminar discussion were on a tradition that ended up in totalitarianism. He used the word. Let's go back to the features. If these are the suggestions coming from the best fascist studies, we can follow them in addressing the problem of applying the concept of fascism to today's far right. I think that Mosse himself showed the way. There is Mosse's not well-known text, his 1979 interview about the Italian Christian democratic leader Aldo Moro, which is dominated, totally dominated, by the issue of the crisis of present democracy. These are Mosse's words. I think that not only as the strength of liberalism and parliamentary government in Western Europe yet to be tested, but the 1970s opened the first post-war decade of scarcity now that the expansion has reached its limits. What effect will this have? Will this not, in fact, make the old political parties obsolete? Will we not need a new political system to deal with a quite unprecedented fact, the fact of scarcities of the limits or resources? Historians are bad prophets, but I believe that the new age of scarcity, even if it does not take the same form as the Great Depression or the crisis of the First World War, will lead to strains and stresses that may produce forms of government which I cannot prophesy. I have said before, and I want to re-emphasize, I do not think history repeats itself. I do not think that because of this crisis we will once again enter a fascist epoch. Perhaps bits and pieces of authoritarianism will be used, but they will be put together in a different way. I think this position is illuminating for the 1970s, but illuminating also for our present. Today we have authoritarianism aplenty, but are we entering a fascist epoch? Many of the leaders or movements under scrutiny as fascists not only lack all the fundamental elements historiography suggests, but show ideas or inclinations deeply contrary to the fascist ones. Many of them revere the sovereignty of popular will, consider electoral consent as the only legitimization of power, introduce themselves as representatives of the people. On the contrary, the fascists abhorred parties, wanted to abolish them and introduce themselves as an aristocratic minority despising the masses. Many of today's radical rightists are racist and xenophobic. Of course, the Nazis were, but other fascists, the Italians, for example, were not so for almost 20 years. Today's ultra-right is often independentist. Fascists hope for the strongest possible nation. Today's populists are anti-migrants. Fascists wish to enlarge the country to foreigners. In the end, my opinion is similar to what Roger Griffin has colorfully noted about the leader of the British radical right, Nigel Farage. You can be a total xenophobic, racist, male, chauvinist bastard and still not be a fascist. In the book on fascism, I just mentioned, Stanley Payne recommends never to confuse fascists, conservatives, and nationalist rightists. I fully share his advice. I think that the danger to the stability of Western democracies does not come from fascism now, but exactly from the conservative right. Therefore, in spite of my love for complexity and ambivalence, I do not share Traverso's conclusions. Post-fascism, para-fascism, quasi-fascism, and fascism-inspired seem to me categories that elude the real problem. The fact that a political phenomenon does not like us does not make it fascist, nor makes it fascist the fact that this phenomenon may be a relevant danger to democracy. As I already anticipated, I think fascism is still with us, though only as a minority affair, fortunately. Professor Traverso is probably right in suggesting that the definition of this new reality as populist is misleading. But I think post-fascism is deceptive as well. I think, as Mosse suggested, that this new far-right surge can be better understood as a new form of authoritarianism. But beware, not accepting the fascist connotation of the new radical right does not mean diminishing the relevance of today's severe menaces for democracy. Perhaps the only good reason I see for the repeated call to fascist danger is the invitation not to undervalue this. Nevertheless, framing the problem, as Traverso does, I think is risky. Equating today's political trends, even in an indirect way, to fascism is, in my opinion, historically inexact, as I tried to prove, but also politically dangerous. First, stressing the recurring return of fascism implies giving fascism a strength I think it has not. Young people who do not know anything about real historical fascism may be impressed by the mythical vision of an ever-resurging movement. Second, if we continue to see fascism everywhere, we risk removing our attention from the real dangers and menaces that still threaten democracy and that have nothing to do with fascism. The fact that the new forms of ultra-rightism generally avoid declaring, as fascists did, that the time for democracy ended does not make them less dangerous. If anything, I think they are even more dangerous because past historical experience taught us how to mobilize antibodies against fascism. At the same time, we have to invent now our answer mechanisms against these new enemies from nothing. Third, accentuating the fascist feature of today's mass politics brings to undervalue another deep and I think unnoticed change. The end of anti-fascism as a discriminating factor in the conservative discourse. Many politicians and intellectuals from the right put fascism and anti-fascism at the same negative level, suggesting to overcome both, or rather consider anti-fascism today as today's authoritarianism. This is a cultural change on which I urge historians to reflect. Conclude. Please consider what you like about my considerations, but I am sure that we, including Enzo Traverso, will agree on at least one point. In the present situation, the historical study of fascism is more important than ever. We need to remember every day, as George Mosse did and as Traverso in his conclusions recalled, that democracies are not invincible and that the great gift we have the fortune to have can be easily lost and has to be defended at any cost. Thank you very much.